Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Rosie.
How are you doing, Rosie?
I'm good. It's a gloomy day.
I know, but that's a perfect day to talk about what we're talking about tonight.
True, a gloomy topic.
Yeah, this is part 2 of our coverage on John Wayne Gacy. Last week, we briefly talked about his childhood and discussed our thoughts on the rough situation in his family. This week, we're going to start getting into his adult life and how he became the monster we know him as. We'll be covering basically 1960 to 1970. Real quick before we jump into the story, we do want to mention that we have a new Patreon episode out.
Yay!
Irene Violet Monroe. We posted about it on Instagram, but it's from 1920 England, and it's very interesting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say it's a doozy.
So patrons can go listen to that right now, and if you're not a patron yet, it's available over on the $2 level, so go check it out.
Keep it in mind.
Rosie, are you ready to jump back into this?
I'm ready. In 1960, John was 18, and he was interested in politics. So he started working for a Democratic candidate in his neighborhood as an assistant precinct captain.
I'd guess it was more like assistant to the precinct captain, since it's a pretty huge responsibility for an 18-year-old to take on.
I would imagine.
I don't know for sure, but of course this led to more disappointment from his father, who, like we talked about last week, was a veteran, and he saw this as, a soft office job, not like a real man's job.
It seems like a legit job to me, but whatever.
Yeah, it's a lot of responsibility.
Well, despite all this, John's father helped him finance a car. It was in his father, John Stanley's name, but John Wayne made the payments on it. When the two were at odds, his father would withhold the keys to the car from him, even though he was an adult making the payments on it. But John just bought an extra pair of keys for it. Of course, his father was mad about this and removed the distributor cap from the car instead to render the vehicle useless.
John said he was pretty put out after this incident, and 3 days later, when his father finally replaced the part in the car, John decided to leave his parents' house and drove halfway across the country to Las Vegas, which is almost 2,000 miles from Chicago. So he was pretty ready to be done with his father's hassle at this point.
Yeah, it seems like he wanted to go as far as he could.
Yeah.
John was able to find a job working for an ambulance service. Then he was transferred to Palm Mortuary, where he worked as an attendant for the next 3 months. Part of his job was to watch the mortuary overnight, and he slept on a cot behind the embalming room.
No, this is, sounds like a depressing job. This is apparently when he had a very odd moment that he told people about later, and we want to warn you, it's very disturbing and just icky, so brace yourselves.
I would imagine there'd be a lot of odd moments in the mortuary, but okay.
Yeah.
He claims that one evening, while working there, he had seen the body of a deceased teenage boy and decided to climb into the coffin. He went on to embrace and caress the cadaver before coming to his senses and feeling shocked by what he was doing.
So, yuck. But this event jolted him when he, realized what he was doing. And the next day, he actually called his mom and asked if his father would allow him to return home, which he did. So I guess he freaked himself out. But that day, he began his nearly 30-hour drive back home to Chicago.
Wow. That seems more than just a moment. That seems really
Like, why?
Explosion sized.
Yeah.
How? Why? Very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Once he got home, John enrolled himself at Northwestern Business College, and 3 years later, in 1963, he graduated.
Well, this was a big accomplishment for him at the time because he hadn't even graduated high school. But right after graduating from this business college, he was able to get a job with the Nunn Bush Shoe Company with on-the-job training for a management position.
What? He must have been a really smooth talker. He's had like a big variety of jobs.
Yeah, as we go through this, it's pretty obvious that he's very charismatic and manipulative.
He had also grown close to a woman named Marilyn Myers, who worked with him there. And in March of 1964, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. While they were dating, John became a member of the local U.S. Junior Chamber, or Jaycees, which is a leadership training organization for people between 18 and 40.
Yeah, so he was very active in this organization, as we'll talk about throughout this outline. In April of 1964, they actually named him Key Man. So very important to them, apparently. And just to get an idea of the values of this organization, Rosie, I'm going to have you read the code from their JC Creed.
So just to be nitpicky, it's not Key Man. He's not in possession of the keys to the building. He's like the Key Man.
As far as I know,
important.
Maybe he gets the keys, but I would imagine it's more of just like a VIP
Very
situation.
Interesting. Okay, the Creed states, "We believe that faith in God gives meaning and purpose to human life, that the brotherhood of man transcends the sovereignty of nations, that economic justice can best be won by free men through free enterprise, that government should be of laws rather than of men, that Earth's great treasure lies in human personality, and that service to humanity is the best work of life."
I mean, it sounds pretty noble. And the fact that John was named Key Man, meant that his community here had a pretty high view of him. Which is why I say he was obviously charismatic.
Interesting. That same year, the Nunn Bush Shoe Company transferred him to the Springfield, Illinois location where he worked as a salesman until he was eventually promoted to the manager there. Man, this guy just smooths through life. Rolls along smoothly.
Well, yeah, this is the company who he was being trained as a manager from the time he started there.
Oh, that's right. Okay. No, it's making sense. Then in September of 1964, John and Marilyn were officially married.
So everything from his love life to his social and career life seemed to be going great in 1964. But soon after this, he had another, we'll just call it odd event.
Or moment.
Yeah.
John claims that one of his colleagues from the Springfield Jaycees took him out for drinks one night and then let John crash on his sofa. John said that while he was drunk on the sofa, the male colleague started to get romantic with him and went on to perform oral sex on John while he was drunk.
So obviously this is a complicated situation, especially when you hear it told in retrospect from a serial killer. But I do wonder how that situation unfolded, if the other guy was taking advantage of John or if it was more amicable. We don't really know. But given everything that would happen in the future, who knows what role John actually played in this, even though he kind of portrayed himself as the victim here. Anyway, this is what John said happened, which really sucks for Marilyn, his wife, that this kind of thing is happening to her husband or that he's involved in it. But interestingly, by the next year, John had gotten a big promotion within the junior chamber.
In 1965, John was named the vice president on the Springfield Jaycees, as well as ranking number 3 on a list of the most outstanding Jaycees in Illinois. What an honor.
Yeah, so again, very respected within his community, but he wouldn't be in Springfield for much longer.
After John and Marilyn got married, her father decided to buy 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Whoa! Her father offered John the opportunity to move to Waterloo and manage the 3 restaurants. Whoa! Again, just handing him
Yeah, it's
so
a
much.
pretty nice opportunity he's getting here from his father-in-law.
They'd be able to live in her parents' old house, and he'd earn a share of the profits, as well as a base salary of $15,000 per year, which would equal to about $124,000 a year in 2021.
Six
Not
figures.
bad.
Yeah, so free house and a great job. Seems like a pretty good deal for him. All he had to do was complete another management course for this specific job, so why not take it? I know John was having a rough time with his own father, but now, Marilyn's father here seems to be taking him under his wing. I mean, that's a big gift to give your son-in-law, giving him all that responsibility and money. I mean,
And a house.
I don't know what their personal relationship was like, but it seems like a pretty nice thing to do for him.
After completing the course, the couple moved to Waterloo and followed through with a plan. In February of 1966, Marilyn gave birth to a baby boy. Then, just over a year later, in March of 1967, she gave birth to a girl. John said that this time in his life was perfect, and that he'd finally earned his father's approval, having a nice family and a successful career. John Stanley even apologized to John Wayne when his parents were visiting in July of 1966. Apparently, he shook John's hand and said, "Son, I was wrong about you," going on to apologize for the physical and emotional abuse he'd inflicted when John was growing up.
Wow, that's not something people get very often.
No, that's huge.
At this point, seemed like everything was falling into place, you know? He was finally at a point in his life where he could really do some good, put some good out in the world, and have a normal family life and just do what people do. But despite his outside appearances, John had some other stuff going on in his life at the time. At KFC, the majority of John's employees were teenagers, but despite this, he socialized with them after work, particularly the teenage boys. And he actually put together a room in his basement, which he called the club, where he'd let his teenage employees come hang out to drink alcohol and play pool.
Oh, this is a really bad idea.
Yeah, I'm sure Marilyn's father would have been a huge fan of this after everything he gave John, but it turned into more than just socialization.
After giving the boys alcohol, he would flirt with them and make sexual advances. If they rejected him, he would claim that it was just a test of their morals or play it off as a joke. But if they didn't reject him, it would lead to sexual abuse.
So John was continuing the cycle of abuse. And like we talked about last week, this is something he experienced, but it was never properly dealt with for many reasons. And then here we see where it led. It had to be intimidating to be alone in a basement with your boss, who not only employs you, but now is giving you booze, getting you a little more pliable. And kids typically want to please their first boss, so he had a lot of power over them here.
But John kept up appearances on the outside, joining the Waterloo Jaycees and putting in many hours there, on top of his time-consuming management at KFC. He would regularly bring fried chicken to the JC meetings and told people to call him Colonel. That's so weird.
Like Colonel Sanders.
He was held in high regard within the Waterloo chapter as well, and in 1967 they named him Outstanding Vice President. Then he became part of the board of directors.
Yeah. So he was known to be very ambitious, somewhat braggy about his accomplishments, but apparently some members of this particular Waterloo JC chapter also had a bit of a shady side.
Some of them, including John Wayne Gacy, were deeply involved in things like drug use, porn, prostitution, and even wife swapping. But in August of 1967, John crossed another serious line. Okay, the JCs were supposed to be like outstanding leaders, right?
Well, that's what their creed said. But, yeah, as we can see, well, the one back in Springfield, had him stay on his couch, and you know what they did.
Yeah.
And now this one in Waterloo is has some weird stuff going on too.
Yikes. A fellow JC member had a 15-year-old son named Donald Voorhees. Gacy secretly invited the teen boy over to his house, promising to show him an old stag film.
So an old stag film was illegally produced porn from the early 21st century, because I guess porn wasn't officially decriminalized in the U.S. until 1969, which I didn't know till researching this.
Yeah.
Anyway, when Donald arrived at Gacy's basement clubhouse, he gave the 15-year-old boy alcohol to loosen him up, as was his MO. And then something awful and disgusting happened. So again, brace yourselves.
When the boy was drunk and aroused from watching the heterosexual film, Gacy told the boy that it was necessary to have sex with a man before you can start having sex with women. Then he persuaded the boy to engage in oral sex with him.
So not only was he using his power over his teenage employees at KFC, but now he was starting to abuse the children of his colleagues at the junior chamber, which is supposed to be meant to help young adults. Remember those values you just brought up that we read earlier? And yet this happened.
I'm so surprised he's that gutsy to do this to a member. You know, his dad was a member of the JCs or whatever. Do you think the dad knew about what was going on?
No. Because he finds out later.
After this happened in 1967, Gacy went on to abuse several other youths. For one of them, Gacy actually baited him by saying he should have sex with John's own wife, Marilyn, before using this as blackmail against the kid to coerce the boy into performing oral sex on Gacy himself.
This part of the story was so shocking to me because I really wonder how that went down with Marilyn. You know, I suppose the swinging they were doing with other JC members could have primed her for it, but it makes me wonder, given John's future activities, if he was abusive to her or forced her into this stuff, or if she even did do it. You know, there's very little info about this event. But John also used another tactic to bait teenage boys at this time.
He told them he was conducting a scientific study on homosexuality and had been commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments for research. He offered boys $50 to be a part of this fake study. What?
Yeah, this guy was so manipulative that he made this kind of crap up. But in 1968, Donald Voorhees came forward and told his father about what John had done to him.
His father immediately called the police, and Gacy was arrested and charged with oral sodomy in March of 1968.
Ugh. Oral sodomy?
I don't think I've ever heard of that term before.
Well, it's odd that it was a sodomy charge and not, child abuse.
Oh.
But like we'll talk about later,
yeah,
it was a different time back then. To put it into perspective, child porn wasn't even made fully illegal until 1990.
How?
And even then, I think it was like a 6-3 split vote or something insane like that. So their priorities were different in this time when Gacy was first arrested. But again, this had to be such a shock to Donald Voorhees' father, who was part of this organization that held Gacy in such high regard, and everyone who knew him at the time saw him as a great guy, and that's the guy who did this to his son.
Man, I'm still coming down off of that child porn fact. I had no idea that it was until 1990. How is that even possible?
Me neither.
That's crazy. Well, another kid, 16-year-old Edward Lynch, also came forward at the time and reported an attempted assault from Gacy, which he was also charged with. Gacy denied all the allegations in these charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. He also claimed that these charges against him were politically motivated because Donald's father had opposed Gacy's nomination as president of the Iowa Jaycees. Gacy even got the support and backing of many other JC members. Of course he did.
Can you imagine how much that would hurt as Donald Voorhees? Like, it had to be hard enough for him just to come forward, but then to have members of an organization his father was part of come out against him and in support of his abuser, that had to just be insane for him.
But on May 10th, 1968, John Wayne Gacy was indicted on the charge. A few months later, on August 30th, 1968, Gacy talked to one of his KFC employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, and offered to pay him $300 to physically assault Donald Voorhees and threaten him that more would come if he testified against Gacy. How does he keep thinking he's going to get away with this? It's like, well, I guess because he's so smooth, right?
I guess so.
A few days later, Russell lured Donald into an isolated park in the country, and once they were alone, he sprayed mace in Donald's eyes and began beating him up. Donald was eventually able to get away, and again, he reported the assault to police. Russell Schroeder was arrested the following day, and although denying it at first, it didn't take long for him to confess to the assault and explain that Gacy had paid him to do it. So, Gacy was given an additional charge for that. On September 12th, 1968, he was ordered to get a psych evaluation. 2 doctors examined him over a 17-day period and concluded that he had an antisocial personality disorder.
We speculated about this last week, but these doctors confirm it. That means he was either diagnosed with sociopathy, psychopathy, or both. But these doctors gave him a somewhat hopeless outlook.
They said he was unlikely to benefit from any therapy or treatment, and he was likely to have repeated conflict with other members of society, but that he was mentally competent to stand trial. Well, that's a little
contradictory.
Yeah.
Yeah, this part's really wild to me. I don't think any good doctor should say this about a patient. Yeah, no human being should be considered hopeless, in my opinion. At least try therapy and treatment. When you tell someone their condition's hopeless and there's no point in therapy, why would they even try to get better? You know? But I'm not the pro here. I don't know what I'm talking about. But I do think the comments that accompanied this report were very interesting. They almost make me question the validity of John's claims about his childhood. But Rosie, will you read that?
It says, "The most striking aspect of the test results is the patient's total denial of responsibility for everything that has happened to him. He can produce an alibi for everything. He presents himself as a victim of circumstances and blames other people who are out to get him. The patient attempts to assure the sympathetic response by depicting himself as being at the mercy of a hostile environment."
All that said, his claims about his childhood seem to be backed up by his mother and sisters, so they're probably mostly true. But instead of taking responsibility for trying to heal and not hurting anyone else the way he was hurt, he used it to excuse himself for the hurt he had caused to other people. And we've said this many times in the past, but it's never okay to abuse another person, even if you were abused yourself. We have so many listeners who are amazing examples of this and who have really taken responsibility for trying to heal and make the best of their situation. And like Rosie talked about in episode 88 on kintsugi, once the vase is broken, it will have lasting effects from the traumatic experience, but it can still be put back together in a beautiful way, rather than staying broken and using its sharp shards to break more vases. But here, John Wayne Gacy is outright excusing himself from responsibility over his actions because of his past abuse.
Despite this, Gacy pleaded guilty to the sodomy charge for Donald Voorhees on November 7th, 1968. But he maintained that he was not guilty on any other charges.
And again, he went on to justify his abusive actions.
Gacy claimed that Donald Voorhees had willingly offered himself to Gacy, and that Gacy succumbed to his own curiosity.
Yikes.
And honestly, even if that was the case, he still should be in trouble, because he's the adult.
Exactly. But again, there were different laws back then. I think it was in the 70s. I have an exact date later, but I think it was like 1969 when actual laws went into place for this. But we'll talk about it later. Anyway, thankfully, the court didn't buy this claim that it was consensual, and John Wayne Gacy was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison on December 3rd, 1968.
On that same day, his wife Marilyn petitioned for divorce, requesting ownership of the home and property, sole custody of the children, and alimony. And she got it. On September 18th, 1969, the divorce was finalized.
Man, that took like 9 months. That's crazy.
Yeah, but I'm glad she got all the stuff she wanted.
Yeah.
Gacy never saw his first wife or his kids again. I think that was a smart move.
Yeah, who could blame her for wanting out after all this came out? Mm-hmm. Especially since Gacy marrying her basically made him rich and successful.
Yeah.
Like, her father gave him such a great opportunity, and he used it to take advantage of teenagers for sex. Mm-hmm. Not only was he breaking the law, but he was, breaking his vow to his wife with teenage boys. It's so weird. I'm still curious about the situation where he offered her up to a boy in order to blackmail him. But again, we don't really know much about that situation.
I have 2 theories for that.
Yeah?
He could have hired a prostitute and said that she was his wife.
Oh, that's true. Because they had the prostitution going on in the club.
In the club. Or maybe he lied to his wife about his age.
Yeah, that could be too. So I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but to put things in perspective, child sexual abuse wasn't considered a crime in the U.S. until 1973. So that's why Gacy was only charged with sodomy here, which, as of 2003 isn't a crime. But some interesting facts I learned while researching this about the history of U.S. law that I had no idea about.
Very interesting.
I wonder if John Wayne Gacy had any impact on these laws.
Yeah.
Because it's only 5 years after he did this.
Well, while in prison, he acted like a model prisoner.
Of course.
Yeah, right. Finishing his high school education, as well as becoming the head cook in the prison, joining the inmate... There's a junior chamber for inmates?
Yeah.
What?
Well, yeah, they have social groups there in there too.
He grew the chamber from 50 members to 650 members while he was there. He then oversaw the installation of a mini golf course in the prison recreation yard. How?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like that much of punishment, It's just like, it's interesting how much stuff they can still do when they're being punished for crimes like this. Anyway, despite being given a hopeless report from his psych evaluation, he was still making an effort to be productive, or at least to appear that way. Like we said, we know from his past, he was very cunning, very manipulative. So all of this could have just been part of his plan, part of his act, so he could get back out there and keep being a terrible person, which we know he did. So, of course, as seems to always happen in these cases, Gacy got out way earlier than what his sentence was. Probably
because they were afraid he'd try to install a real golf course. Like, we better get this guy out.
Well, I don't think it was his idea to put the golf course in. He was just assigned to oversee it.
It's just so weird that was even like, hey, you want to oversee the installation of the golf course?
Well, they put prisoners to work, If something needs to be done, they have the prisoners do it.
Well, I know, but that was for the prisoners to, hang out at.
I can't remember which prison he was in, but, every prison's different.
Yeah.
This one, even the head cook was a prisoner. It was him, so.
This is crazy. After serving only 18 months out of his 10-year sentence, he was granted parole with a year of probation, where he was required to move in with his mother back in Chicago and observe a 10 p.m. curfew.
18 months out of 10 years. That's...
And he finished high school while doing...
That's
he accomplished a lot.
That's 15% of his term, right? I don't know. I'm bad at math. But What did you say before?
That, like, all he was there for was to finish high school. Like, it seems like, like he just
Yeah.
got a couple things done quick and then was out of there.
Yeah, anyway, this reminds me of the Steven Stainer case. Like, the guy who abducted Steven for 7 years and only got, like,
right.
2 years or something stupid like that. Anyway, while Gacy was in prison, his father died of liver cirrhosis on Christmas Day of 1969. Now, remember, his relationship with his father, it was very strained. When he was arrested for this, he was blaming a lot of the stuff he did on his relationship with his father.
Right.
But apparently when he was told about it, Gacy collapsed on the floor sobbing and requested supervised compassionate leave to attend the funeral. But that was denied. Anyway, just knowing how manipulative he is, I did wonder if that breakdown was all part of his act to try to get on the good side of the prison. And because, like the psych evaluation said, he was always trying to solicit pity from people by making himself a victim. And I just wonder if he was really brokenhearted about this, like he was portraying here, or if it was part of an act. And I mean, relationships with abusers are complicated. We learned that from Grace a few weeks back. When your abuser is also one of your parents, it's really hard for some people to only see them as an abuser and not also love them as their parent. So I'm trying to keep that in mind now, just how complicated it is. It's something I can't imagine or even begin to understand. But we know what John Wayne Gacy went on to do, so I'm not going to sympathize with him over this. Anyway, on June 18th, 1970, John Wayne Gacy was released from prison and was moving back to Chicago.
One of his friends from the Waterloo Jaycees picked him up after his release. His name was Clarence Lane, and he was one of the people who stood behind Gacy during his indictment and still believed that Gacy was innocent. On the car ride home from prison, Gacy told Clarence that he'd never go back to jail and planned to reestablish himself in Waterloo.
I don't know why he would want to make his fresh start in the same place where he messed up so bad.
Well, he had to go back, though.
Well, no, he had to go back to Chicago.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
And for some reason, he had it in his head that he was going to go back to Waterloo. Because, yeah, he was court-ordered to live with his mom for at least a year. So if he did go back to Waterloo, his whole never going back to jail thing wouldn't work out too well, which we know it didn't anyway.
He arrived in Chicago on June 19th, 1970, and was able to find a job as a short-order cook.
And that's where we'll pick back up next week, with Gacy heading into the 1970s and being even more awful than he was before. Now, like we mentioned last week, this is a really dense story because it's so famous and there's so much information about it. We'll try not to spend forever on it, but there are so many victims of this monster, and the story has so many things to learn from. Like, even in this episode, I wonder if the wording of the psych evaluation had any impact on the way he turned out. Like, basically saying that therapy won't help. I wonder if someone would have honestly tried to help him recover from his obvious sickness rather than saying therapy and treatment would do no good. Could these 33 lives have been saved? I mean, who knows? But it is interesting that there were so many serial killers between 1970 and 2000, and also that, psychology and the study of the mind has made so much progress since then. It was nowhere near what it is now back then. So I wonder if there's anything to those two things kind of coinciding. Anyway, that report just seems so matter of fact, and now it seems a lot more nuanced and tailored towards healing.
Right.
I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. I don't think you would ever hear a report like that nowadays.
Yeah.
Because I do think it seems like back then it wasn't about healing or treatment. It was about being labeled and pushed aside.
Yeah, kind of filtering out
Yeah.
quote unquote bad people from society and just separating them.
Stamping you on the forehead.
Which, was also understandable. They wanted to protect innocent people from people that might harm them.
Mm-hmm.
But, as we know, mental illness is very complicated, and it's not their fault.
Right.
And obviously, the actions he's doing because of his mental illness, he's responsible for. But I just wonder what real therapy could have done to help.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. A valid curiosity.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's it for this week. Rosie, do you want to read this review?
Mm-hmm. I really do. It's called My Favorite Podcast. Aww.
From Melissa Thrasher.
It says, Ryan and Rosie are determined to make their mission heard, making people aware of what victims of crimes and abuse go through during and after what they've gone through. They are both very genuine in their empathy for victims. You can hear it in their voices. They always have great cases they speak about, and I absolutely love the fact that they give their listeners voices by reading their stories. Keep up the good work. I listen while I'm at work and wish they had new episodes daily instead of weekly.
Me too, Melissa.
Very, very sweet.
I am working on putting out episodes more often on Patreon, so there's, more new content
Right.
for them. But thank you, Melissa. We really appreciate that. And
yes, thank you very much. We really liked your review.
Yeah. And if you are new to our show, as Melissa mentioned here, we do love sharing listener stories. We're in contact with a few people now who are wanting to share their stories, and we're working on getting that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do have your own personal story that you would like to share, if you've heard our listener stories, you kind of know what we do.
And also, if you do have a listener story, don't feel pressure. If you decide that you want to back out and not share it, we are not going to be picky about that.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So, if you want to dip your toes in to see if it's for you, go ahead. We're not going to be pushy or anything.
And, even in the future, after it's published, if sometime in the future you decide you don't want it up anymore,
yeah,
you can always reach out to us and we'll take it down, But just keep it in mind if it's something you would like to do. Thanks to Grace, we've discovered that it's pretty easy to do them over Zoom if people want to tell their own story with their voice. Mm-hmm. So there's an option, or if you just want to write it all out and have us read it, we can do that as well. So that said, that's where we'll wrap it up. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks. Bye.